There are films that feel like storms, sudden and sharp, and then there are films that feel like winter nights, quiet at first but with a cold that grows until it sinks deep into your bones. That is the peculiar electricity that surrounds John Wick, 2014, a film that begins with the stillness of grief and then erupts into a meticulously engineered ballet of vengeance. Before a single fight occurs, before a single bullet arcs through the air, the film tells us through its silence that it is less about violence and more about the emotional cost of breaking a man who had already lost everything. And from the very first moment, you sense you are entering a world that was crafted not just with artistic ambition, but with the precision of a financial bet, a technological gamble, and a creative risk that could have shattered careers if it failed to land. This movie was not born from comfort or corporate certainty. It came from a place of desperation. Keanu Reeves' career was at a precarious stage, the directors were first-timers, and the studio backing it was testing the waters of a new action subgenre at a time when audiences were fatigued with shaky cameras and chaotic editing. This wasn't just another action film, it was a calculated attempt to redesign what action could feel like, cleaner, sharper, more physically honest, and anchored in a character whose humanity mattered more than his firepower. The financial logic behind the project was equally daring. Take a modest budget in the $20 to $30 million range, strip away unnecessary CGI expenses, and invest instead in choreography density, stunt innovation and world-building clarity. In an industry dominated by expensive superhero universes, this was practically a startup. And like a startup, its opening minutes act as the pitch deck. We see a man who was once a ghost in the criminal underworld but somehow found love, only to lose it. We see a dog that is not a plot device but a symbol of investment, the last emotional asset he owns. When that symbol is stolen from him, the narrative does not show rage. It shows vacancy. As if something deep inside him collapses like a financial market going into freefall. And the beauty here, literature-loving friends, is that the film doesn't rush. It behaves like a disciplined engineer. It lets the emotional foundation set before any machinery begins to move. From an industry perspective, what happened behind the scenes is just as poetic. Two stunt legends who had never directed a feature before were given the reins, and in doing so, the studio essentially funded an R&D lab disguised as a movie. Their goal was to test whether highly technical, rhythmically precise gun fu could serve as a new visual language, mixing martial arts geometry with firearm kinetics in long takes that respected the viewer's comprehension. The data they were collecting wasn't just audience engagement, it was retention of movement clarity. Essentially, they were solving the same problem that engineers face when creating user interfaces. Make complexity readable, make speed comprehensible, make a high-stakes world feel effortless to navigate. Even the lighting choices speak the language of investment. Cool neon hues contrasted with warm tungsten interiors, creating emotional zones like financial districts mapped into color. The nightclub sequence, even before it arrives later in the film, is hinted at through early design cues. The blues, reds, and purples create a visual algorithm that guides the viewer's expectations. This wasn't an accident. This was predictive design. The filmmakers were building a world where colors act like signals in a trading system. What also stands out is how the film treats silence. Modern action films often fear silence because it lowers short-term audience excitation. But here silence is the currency of tension. It accumulates. It compounds. And when it breaks cleanly, the way a financial bubble bursts after too much pressure accumulates beneath the surface. This structural patience is what gives the film its prestige feel. It trusts the viewer. It trusts the world it is building. And it trusts that emotional investments pay off more than spectacle. But beyond the art, there is the capital logic. The movie's financial risk was surprisingly elegant. Cast a major star whose goodwill with audiences remains high, keep budget moderate, prioritize practical effects to reduce post-production cost overruns, and design fight scenes that can be shot efficiently because they rely on choreography rather than expensive destruction. That economic formula is the hidden backbone of the film. It allowed the filmmakers to put money exactly where it has the highest emotional ROI. Character, world building, kinetic clarity, and thematic resonance. And then there is the emotional engine of the plot itself. A grieving man who had escaped violence is pulled back because someone took from him the last thing tethering him to kindness. This is not the story of revenge. It is the story of a relapse. A man falling back into the only identity he once knew, not because he wants it, but because his world leaves him no other path. The emotional economics here are profound. The opportunity cost of peace becomes too high when the world refuses to let him keep it. This is behavioral economics disguised as drama, how trauma alters decision-making, how grief reshapes incentives, how a man returns to the version of himself he hoped had died. The opening 15 minutes of the film are a study in emotional minimalism and technical maximalism. Every frame is meticulously calibrated to teach us the system we are about to enter. A hidden economy of assassins, a hospitality code that behaves like contract law, and a protagonist who is treated not just as a man, but as an industry legend whose very name is a form of currency. And as the camera slowly begins to reveal this underground ecosystem, we sense that this movie is not just telling a story, it is preparing a world franchise. This is what makes the introduction feel so hypnotic. It is grief turned into architecture, violence turned into art, and risk turned into a brand new cinematic language. And my literature-loving friends, that is where the true magic of this film resides. In the harmony between emotion and engineering, between loss and design, between storytelling and the quiet, invisible mathematics that makes a film like this possible in the first place. When the story begins to uncoil, it does so with the patience of a craftsman who understands that the early chapters of a narrative are not merely events, they are investments. The first half of the film behaves like a startup's earliest prototype phase. You see the blueprint of the world, the core emotional problem the protagonist must solve, and the catalytic error that triggers everything that follows. But beneath that simplicity lies an astonishing level of design discipline. Every early scene in this film is placed with a kind of financial intentionality, as if each moment must justify its cost by adding measurable emotional value. We watch our protagonist drifting through grief with the kind of quiet that feels like a suspended heartbeat. His days are structured but hollow. His house feels too large, too cold, and too recently bruised with loss. The arrival of the small beagle, the final gift from the life he once shared, acts almost like a seed-funding injection of hope. The dog is not treated as a prop in the story but as an emotional asset that slowly begins to generate returns. It softens him, warms his silence, and reshapes his mornings. It's a testament to the film's emotional engineering that in only a few minutes, the dog becomes a fully amortized bond of attachment. You can feel the shift in his posture, his breath, even the lighting in his home. The narrative is telling us, here is his new equilibrium. And then comes the market crash. The intrusion of the young men at the gas station is a moment staged with surgical restraint. There is no dramatic music cue, no slow-motion foreshadowing. Instead, the tension emerges from the friction between two worlds. A man who has withdrawn from the violent economy of his past, and reckless youth who believe they are the center of every transaction. Their interest in his car is not about greed, it's about validation, a kind of ego-leveraged impulsiveness. Their mistake is underestimating the value of the asset they are trying to seize, not just the car itself but the identity they are disturbing. When they break into his home that night, the film transitions from emotional drama into precision-driven escalation. The choreography is not violent spectacle, it is narrative accounting. Every blow, every cut, every breath is intended to demonstrate the asymmetry between the risk these men think they're taking and the true cost of awakening the man they're attacking. And the death of the dog lands with the unmistakable finality of an economic collapse. The last stabilizing factor in his inner world is destroyed. What follows is not anger. It is cold recalibration. The morning after, the plot shifts into a kind of operational startup mode. He digs up the concrete floor of his basement, revealing a buried arsenal. This is not just a weapons cache, it is a metaphorical balance sheet of his former life. The film treats this reveal like the discovery of long-frozen capital. It's a return to liquidity. And in doing so, it tells us that the first half of the story is not about revenge, but about reactivating a dormant system. Soon after, the underworld begins to ripple with whispers. The moment news reaches the crime boss that his son has assaulted this particular man, you can see the panic settle in. For the first time, the audience gets to witness the scale of the world the film has hinted at. It's a hidden economy with its own codes, currencies, and regulations. When the father reprimands his son, his tone isn't merely angry, it is economically frightened. He understands market forces. He understands legacy liabilities. He understands that provoking this man is the equivalent of vandalizing a quiet volcano. The film spends the next stretch of its first half letting the audience piece together the architecture of this secret ecosystem. There is the hotel that operates as a safe zone, a kind of Switzerland for assassins. Its rules are treated like contract terms, strict, sacrosanct, and backed by fatal consequences. Then there's the currency of gold coins, each one representing not just money but trust, access, and membership within the ecosystem. The film doesn't over-explain any of this. It treats the viewer with intelligence, allowing economic logic to unfold naturally. As our protagonist begins to prepare himself, the pacing shifts from quiet introspection to clean acceleration. His movements follow the efficiency of someone who has removed emotional friction from decision-making. This is one of the most fascinating parts of the first half. The emotional ROI is now completely reorganized. He is no longer trying to avoid violence. He is reallocating energy toward a mission that feels mathematically necessary. The dog was his last bridge to a peaceful life. With it gone, the opportunity cost of restraint becomes too high. The sequence at the nightclub marks the climax of the first half and the moment when the narrative transitions from setup to active pursuit. This is where the film's early world-building pays dividends. The lighting is pulsating neon, the choreography is geometric, and the energy is hauntingly mechanical. The nightclub behaves like a marketplace, loud, crowded, a place where identities blend and disappear. Here, the protagonist is less a man and more a tool executing a performance audit on the son of the crime boss who shattered his world. What stands out most is the calmness with which he moves. He does not look angry. He does not look frantic. He is operating with the emotional detachment of a surgeon and the precision of someone who has spent years refining an operational blueprint. This calmness is what terrifies the viewer, what tells us that the first half of the plot has done its job. It has shown us what happens when someone tries to reclaim a sense of control after losing everything that once made them human. And by the time he emerges from the nightclub, battered, bleeding but unwavering, the story has completed its pivot. The setup is done, the emotional data is collected, the system is active. The second half will be about the consequences of awakening a force that the world once relied on to maintain its balance. The second half of the film opens with a sensation that feels less like continuation and more like acceleration, as if the narrative has shifted gears and the machinery beneath the story has begun to hum at full capacity. If the first half was about emotional activation and world building, then the second half is about operational execution, a test of whether all the narrative risks and emotional investments will convert into sustained audience engagement, the cinematic equivalent of product-market fit. And my literature-loving friends, this is where the film transforms from a personal tragedy into a high-efficiency system of retribution that runs with the cold logic of an algorithm. The moment the nightclub sequence ends, the stakes become clearer for everyone. The son of the crime boss narrowly escapes, but the message is unmistakable. The man they have provoked is not simply alive, he is inevitable. And you feel the father's fear in a new way now. It's not just the fear of losing his child, it's the fear of losing control of an entire underground economy. John becoming active again is like a seismic disturbance. It disrupts contracts, destabilizes loyalties, and threatens the equilibrium of a world that depends on predictable behavior. Every assassin, every broker, every manager of that hidden network can sense a shift in the system's gravity. As alliances strain and information flows through their channels, the second half becomes a study of escalation management. The crime boss begins to redirect resources, protect key assets, and deploy manpower not unlike a corporation trying to contain a PR catastrophe. His decisions are framed around risk mitigation. Isolate the threat, cut off the target, try to overwhelm him with numbers. But numbers do not matter here. The world has already accepted that this is not a contest of force. This is a test of precision. Our protagonist moves through this world like an expert operator executing a rollout plan. He upgrades his gear, calibrates his movements, anticipates responses before they happen. The film is careful not to make him superhuman. Instead, it portrays him as someone who has trained his instincts into a kind of living calculus. Every shot is purposeful. Every step is placed with intent. Every entry into a new environment is approached like an engineer analyzing a system's weak points. One of the most gripping sequences in the second half takes place in the hotel, that sacred space governed by its own rules. When a contract is placed on him, and one of the fellow assassins attempts to break the hotel's code to eliminate him, the resulting confrontation is less about action and more about the consequences of violating a stable institution. The hotel's rules are not aesthetic, they are economic infrastructure. And the film cleverly shows that institutions survive not because they are moral, but because violating them is expensive. The assassin who attacks him in his room pays the price for disrupting the equilibrium of a neutral zone, just as a corporation would penalize an insider who threatens its internal governance. As the story progresses, the film tightens the emotional lens once again. We return to the father-son dynamic, this time with amplified tension. The son, who once acted with reckless autonomy, now feels the encroaching weight of consequences. His earlier arrogance begins to dissolve into fear, not just of death, but of the realization that his actions have triggered a chain reaction that even his father cannot fully contain. This shift in tone deepens the dramatic economy of the film. It shows us how impulsiveness can create liabilities that entire systems struggle to absorb. Meanwhile, our protagonist continues closing in, guided not by rage but by clarity. This is one of the defining features of the film's second half: emotional transformation into operational efficiency. His grief is no longer the trembling wound it once was. It has solidified into a kind of fuel, a renewable resource that powers every decision. And as he tracks the son to his hideout, the film becomes a study in controlled escalation. The assault is not chaotic. It is structured. It is paced. Feels like a final audit, a reckoning. The confrontation that follows is brief, almost anticlimactic in its efficiency. That is entirely the point. The film refuses to glamorize retribution. Instead, it treats this moment as a necessary endpoint in a chain of cause and effect. The son is dispatched not with theater but with mechanical precision, as if completing the last line in an equation. And with that, the film pivots toward its final movement, the confrontation between the protagonist and the father. This final conflict takes on a different emotional tone. The father, now stripped of his power, faces not just a killer but a man who has nothing left to lose. Their fight is less elegant and more visceral. It lacks the stylized choreography of earlier sequences, emphasizing instead the raw human cost of everything that has happened. The father fights like someone trying to salvage the last fragments of control, while the protagonist fights like someone concluding a cycle he never wanted to begin. By the time the final blow lands, the emotional economy of the story has reached equilibrium. The debt is paid. The system resets. The world returns to its quiet, regulated state. But the protagonist is left with emptiness, the kind of void that no victory can fill. And here the film returns to softness, offering one final emotional gesture. The moment he rescues an injured dog from an animal clinic, a fragile echo of the hope he once lost. This dog is not a replacement. It is a possibility, a spark, a hint that life may still contain warmth despite everything the world has taken from him. And as he walks away into the night, you can feel the film settling into its final emotional rhythm. One that blends exhaustion with renewal, sorrow with faint light. The second half has proven its dramatic efficiency, its emotional clarity, and its structural discipline, leaving us with the lingering realization that this story was never just about vengeance. It was about what a man becomes when the last piece of his heart is taken from him, and what remains when the storm inside him finally begins to quiet. What makes the psychological core of this film so gripping is not the violence itself, but the interior landscape that gives birth to it. When we begin peeling back the emotional architecture of this man, we discover that the story is less about retribution and more about the behavioral economics of grief, identity, and opportunity cost. The film treats human emotion as though it were a fluctuating market, irrational at times but deeply patterned, shaped by previous investments and catastrophic losses. And my literature-loving friends, this is where the film becomes unexpectedly profound. At the center of this emotional engine is a man who once lived within a closed-loop system of violence. In that world, every choice was transactional. Killing wasn't an emotional act, it was a professional service. Loyalty was a form of currency. Reputation was brand capital. And fear operated as a stabilizing economic force. But then, at some point in his past, he exited that economy. He liquidated his assets, relationships, obligations, reputation, and reinvested in a single person. That reinvestment brought him peace, warmth, and the first predictable, non-violent routine of his life. When she died, that emotional portfolio collapsed. But the true psychological break comes later with the death of the dog, not because the animal itself represents something irreplaceable, but because it was the final remnant of his last viable investment. From a behavioral economics perspective, this pushes him into what researchers call loss-induced risk-seeking. When people lose everything they value, they often become more willing to take extreme risks, not out of recklessness, but because the fear of additional loss becomes irrelevant. The opportunity cost of doing nothing becomes higher than the cost of walking back into annihilation. The film communicates this shift wordlessly. There is no dramatic outburst, no moment of cathartic rage. He simply recalibrates. His grief converts into a kind of cold clarity, a psychological state where purpose overrides danger and decision-making becomes hyper-efficient. Notice how he stops hesitating. How his movements become smoother. How his breathing becomes more controlled. He is not becoming monstrous. He is reverting to an identity he once spent everything trying to escape. This tension between past and present defines his entire psychological landscape. He represents what behavioral theorists refer to as identity conflict under high-pressure recursion. His peaceful life softened him, changed him, made him human again. But his violent life was engineered into his muscle memory. Every step he takes is a battle between who he became and who he once was. The tragedy is that the world will only allow him to survive if he returns to the earlier version, the efficient instrument of consequence. Then there is the antagonist's son, a young man defined by impulsivity and what psychologists call unearned entitlement. He behaves like someone who was raised within a system built by other men's violence but has never paid the price for participating in it. His decisions are driven not by strategy but by ego-driven valuation errors. The belief that he can provoke someone with impunity because he sees the world through the narrow lens of privilege. His fatal mistake is mispricing risk. He treats the protagonist like any other man whose boundaries can be violated without cost. His father, however, understands exactly what his son has awakened. He understands brand power. He understands historical volatility. He understands that some forces are not meant to be tested. The father is a fascinating psychological study in his own right. He operates like a seasoned CEO trying to contain a crisis that threatens not just profit but the entire corporate ecosystem. His fear is not moral, it is structural. He knows that his power depends on stability, and stability depends on rules being honored. His son has broken the most sacred of those rules. Do not provoke the one man whose reputation has become a mythological deterrent. His attempts to contain the situation follow a predictable psychological sequence: denial, anger, bargaining, and then resignation. He does not believe he can save his son. He merely hopes to delay the inevitable long enough to preserve some fragment of his world. And then there is the criminal ecosystem itself: the assassins, the hotel, the handlers, the code. These characters form a psychological micro-society governed by conditional trust. Each individual calculates their choices based on expected return, punishment risk, and brand reputation. Every decision is a negotiation between self-interest and institutional loyalty. They behave like players in a high-stakes behavioral game where betrayal is expensive and loyalty is rarely emotional. It is strategic. Within this ecosystem, the protagonist stands out because his motivations are not economic. They are existential. He has no interest in long-term gains or preserving relationships. His goal is a closed system: complete the task, balance the emotional ledger, and disappear. This makes him extraordinarily dangerous because psychological predictability is the foundation of stability in any organized network. His grief-driven clarity makes him unpredictable. Not irrational, he is remarkably rational, but uninterested in self-preservation. One of the most compelling psychological dimensions is his relationship to violence itself. His actions are not fueled by rage. They are fueled by inevitability. He treats violence as a language he once mastered, one he hoped never to speak again, but one he now returns to with the precision of a native speaker. This neutrality toward violence is what creates the film's emotional intensity, not because he enjoys what he does, but because he executes it with the calmness of someone carrying out a moral debt. And finally, there is the new dog, the one he rescues toward the end. From a psychological standpoint, this moment represents a tiny but potent signal of recovery. It is not hope, not yet, but the willingness to open a door that grief had once sealed shut. Behavioral economists call this preference re-expansion, the moment when a grieving person begins to once again value things outside their immediate loss. That small gesture reminds us that beneath the astonishing efficiency, beneath the mythology, beneath the armor of inevitability, he is still a man who once believed in gentleness. And perhaps, as he walks into the night with that dog beside him, he believes, even faintly, that life may still contain enough light to be worth holding on to. What makes the financial story behind this film so extraordinary is that it was never meant to be a blockbuster. It was never designed as a franchise starter, nor was it expected to spawn a global mythology stretching across sequels, spin-offs, and multimedia expansions. Its financial DNA is far more humble, almost experimental. And that is precisely what makes its return on investment one of the most fascinating case studies in modern action cinema. When the project was first conceived, its estimated production budget hovered in the modest range of $20 to $30 million, depending on which accounting layer you examine. This was a stark contrast to the dominant Hollywood model of the time, where tentpole action movies often required $120 to $200 million investments backed by heavy CGI, international stunt units, and massive marketing campaigns. But this film took a different approach: leaner, risk-conscious, innovative in how it allocated funds. The biggest financial gamble was hiring 2 first-time directors. Studio logic usually treats inexperience as liability, but here the producers saw something different. 2 stunt visionaries with an R&D mindset. They didn't need extravagant CGI because they had choreography density. They didn't need armies of VFX artists because they had practical ingenuity. Their philosophy was almost startup-like. Spend less on spectacle, more on precision. Less on scale, more on clarity. And then there was the casting. Keanu Reeves, though respected, was in a transition period. He was not at the commercial heights he once enjoyed, but he carried enormous goodwill among audiences. The financial logic here was brilliant. A superstar typically demands a large portion of the budget, but Keanu accepted a reduced salary in exchange for back-end participation. This lowered upfront cost and aligned incentives. The better the film performed, the more everyone benefited. It was a structure built on trust, discipline, and long-term belief in the project. Production costs were managed with the tightness of a company preparing for a narrow-margin launch. Locations were optimized in New York City using tax incentives. The director's background and stunt work allowed them to choreograph and shoot complex sequences efficiently, reducing reshoot expenses. They planned long takes, which are expensive in terms of training but cheap in terms of post-production. This is the hidden genius of the film's financial architecture. Invest in rehearsals, not in fixes. Build the product right the first time. Minimize patchwork later. Equally fascinating is how the film managed its lighting and cinematography budget. Neon-heavy scenes, for example, are not just stylistic choices, they are economically strategic. LED lighting reduces setup time, power costs, and equipment rentals. Shooting in controlled interiors like clubs and hotels minimizes weather risk, which often causes production delays. Despite its sleek visual identity, the movie is a masterclass in frugal artistry. When it came to marketing, the approach shifted from frugal to concentrated. The studio allocated $15 to $20 million in promotional spending, modest by action movie standards, but deployed with remarkable intelligence. Instead of relying on 4-quadrant marketing, which targets all demographics, the campaign was tailored to precision audiences: action lovers, gaming communities, martial arts fans, and online forums that respond to authenticity over polish. Trailers emphasized choreography clarity. Posters highlighted the mythic aura around the protagonist. Keanu's public image as a humble, grounded person was leveraged to rebuild emotional trust with audiences. Even the dog became a marketing icon, symbolizing the film's emotional stakes in a single image. The marketing wasn't loud, it was sharp, deliberate, and human. When the movie finally hit theaters, its box office trajectory mirrored the behavior of an undervalued stock suddenly recognized for its intrinsic worth. Domestic gross approached $43 million, while international territories brought the worldwide total to around $88 million. At first glance, these numbers seem modest compared to modern action blockbusters, but the key is the break-even multiplier. For a film with a production budget under $30 million and marketing spend roughly equal to that, breaking even required approximately $60 to $70 million worldwide. Crossing $88 million established the film as a profitable asset, modestly at first, but immensely when combined with post-theatrical revenue streams. This is where the real ROI magic happens. Home video sales were massive. Estimations show tens of millions in Blu-ray digital rentals and streaming licensing fees. The film became a sleeper hit, the kind that grows rather than fades. Its shelf life proved unusually strong because the action design rewarded rewatching. This created what behavioral economists call long-tail engagement, meaning revenue continued for years rather than spiking only during release. Cable rights, streaming licensing, and international redistribution added layers of profit. What began as a $20 to $30 million experiment evolved into a high-yield franchise platform. Sequels expanded the world, merchandise licensing grew, video games surfaced, and multimedia adaptations began forming. The brand became a global symbol for kinetic purity. Financial analysts often point to this film as an example of CAPEX discipline meeting creative innovation, a project that spent little but thought deeply. The long-term return on investment is astonishing. When factoring theatrical grosses, home media, streaming licensing, and franchise lifecycle profit, analysts estimate the overall ROI across the entire brand has multiplied into the hundreds of millions. What started as a compact revenge story turned into a self-sustaining economic ecosystem. And what's more impressive is how the film monetized emotion. The death of the dog wasn't just a narrative device. It fueled meme culture, social conversation, and fan loyalty. It became a marketing engine that didn't cost the studio a single extra dollar. This organic virality boosted engagement without increasing ad spend. In today's analytics-driven film market, organic engagement is often more valuable than paid impressions. Finally, the film's economic philosophy, frugal production paired with strong artistic identity, has been adopted by other studios. It changed the action genre's cost expectations. It demonstrated that financial success does not require spectacle overload. It requires clarity, discipline, and emotional sincerity. So when we look at the film today, we're not just looking at an action masterpiece. We're looking at a $30 million experiment that reshaped an entire segment of the industry, proved the financial power of precision, and established that even the smallest artistic gamble can grow into a global franchise when handled with intelligent capital strategy. What makes the filmmaking technology behind this movie so remarkable is that it never announces itself loudly. There are no sprawling CGI set pieces, no enormous digital landscapes, no physics-breaking animated sequences. Instead, the film commits to something far more difficult: innovation through restraint. Every frame is engineered to feel clean, readable, and emotionally grounded, and the technology behind that clarity is a combination of discipline, precision, and a deep respect for the audience's eye. In a cinematic era drowning in rapid cuts and digital overwhelm, this film's approach feels almost like a quiet revolution. One of its most important technological choices was the decision to shoot on ARRI Alexa cameras, a system known for its wide dynamic range and soft, organic digital texture. This was crucial for the film's night-heavy aesthetic. Neon lights, dark alleys, shadowed interiors, these environments can easily fall apart on weaker sensors. But the Alexa's ability to hold detail in both highlights and shadows allowed the filmmakers to create images that felt rich instead of muddy. The camera's color science brought out a painterly contrast between the cold blues of grief and the warm ambers of memory, giving the film a psychological color signature. Lens choice played an equally important role. The cinematographers leaned into anamorphic lenses, which provide that distinctive horizontal flare and gentle distortion around the edges. But more importantly, anamorphics compress space. This subtle squeezing effect makes movement feel faster, more kinetic, and more intimate. When the protagonist rushes down a hallway or pivots around a corner, the lens isn't just recording the action, it's amplifying velocity. It's shaping emotion through optics. In many ways, the lens becomes a silent narrator, telling us how the world feels rather than how it looks. The lighting design is another example of technology serving emotion. Instead of flooding scenes with traditional Hollywood lighting, the film leans heavily on LED practicals, especially in the iconic nightclub sequence. LEDs allowed for quick color shifts, low heat output, and tight spatial control, crucial for scenes where the camera moves rapidly and actors perform complex choreography. The neon palette wasn't just stylistic, it was logistical. LEDs reduce power requirements, minimize setup time, and allow for consistent visual tone across multiple shooting days. This efficiency becomes a hidden form of innovation, technology enabling rhythm. The choreography itself is also technological in nature, though not in the digital sense. The directors, both veterans of stunt coordination, approached action as a kind of human-engineered physics system. They developed what became known as gun fu, a blend of judo, jiu-jitsu, close-quarters combat, and firearm discipline. But behind this choreography lies an enormous amount of technical preparation. Months of training, motion analysis, and repetitive rehearsal until movement became instinctive. The goal was to eliminate the need for cutting around mistakes. Every sequence was designed to be shot in long, fluid takes, which placed an enormous technical burden on camera operators, focus pullers, and stunt teams. Yet the result is seamless. You feel like you're watching a continuous flow of cause and effect, rather than a fragmentation of images stitched together in post-production. And then there's the editing, done with the restraint of someone who believes that the audience deserves clarity. Instead of using rapid cuts to simulate excitement, the editors relied on longer takes and controlled pacing. This is surprisingly difficult. Long takes demand precision from every department: choreography, lighting, camera movement, focus, and timing. A single mistake means resetting the entire sequence. But when technology and artistry align, the result feels almost hypnotic. The action becomes choreography rather than chaos. Color grading, done in DaVinci Resolve, shaped the emotional world of the film. The grading process leaned heavily on controlled saturation, not overly vibrant, but glowing in specific zones. Blues and purples dominate the criminal underworld, while yellows and warm tones appear in moments tied to memory. This is a psychological strategy. Colors become emotional shorthand. Healing is warm. Violence is cold. And the protagonist is pulled between these two color worlds for the entire runtime. The technology behind grading is invisible, but its emotional impact is unmistakable. Sound design also reflects technical innovation. Instead of going for exaggerated Hollywood gunshots, the sound team blended real weapon recordings with spatial reverb layers that create a sense of physical presence without overwhelming the ear. The mix prioritizes clarity. Each footstep, breath, shell casing, and impact is positioned within the stereo field with almost surgical placement. Using Avid Pro Tools, mixers crafted a soundscape that behaves like a language. Silence becomes tension. Reverb becomes intimidation. Bass becomes emotional weight. Even the quiet moments feel engineered, as if the sound team understood that space itself can be a character. Another subtle but powerful technological choice is the use of digital stabilization and motion extraction. Rather than shaking the camera for effect, the filmmakers stabilized movement to maintain readability. This decision reflects a philosophy that technology should enhance comprehension, not overwhelm it. When action is shot cleanly and stabilized intelligently, viewers can follow the physics of each movement. This transforms combat from spectacle into storytelling. One of the most interesting innovations, though seldom discussed, is the data workflow. The filmmakers adopted a hybrid digital pipeline where footage was quickly ingested, tagged, and organized to allow near-instant review of choreographed sequences. This reduced downtime on set and enabled rapid adjustment of choreography based on real-time playback. In complex action filmmaking, this is gold. It prevents errors, protects consistency, and maintains momentum on shoot days where time is literally money. Finally, the film's practical effects are a masterclass in economic technology. Squibs, breakaway props, reactive surfaces, and stunt rigging all contribute to grounded physicality. Instead of relying on digital blood or digital hits, the filmmakers favored realism. This groundedness becomes a form of innovation in a digital era. Practical effects force the world to obey physics, and physics communicates emotional honesty. Taken together, these technological choices created a new aesthetic language. Clean lines, readable action, psychological lighting, disciplined color, immersive sound, and choreography that feels like mathematics in motion. It is innovation without noise, technology without ego, craftsmanship without spectacle. And in achieving that harmony, the film quietly rewrote the standards of modern action cinema. What often goes unnoticed when people watch a kinetic, tightly controlled action film like this one is the tremendous machinery operating behind the curtain, an entire world of scheduling, logistics, workforce allocation, contingency planning, and decision-making under pressure. If the emotional story is about a man returning to a past he tried to bury, the production story is about a team of filmmakers constructing a new cinematic identity under constraints that would have broken less organized productions. And my literature-loving friends, this is where the film becomes a masterclass in project management. At its core, the film's production was an exercise in precision manufacturing. Time was the first and most unforgiving commodity. With a modest budget and a tight schedule, the directors and producers had to treat every shooting day like a high-stakes trading session. Minutes mattered. Weather mattered. Human fatigue mattered. Every delay would ripple outward into escalating costs. So they built a system where each department functioned like an integrated assembly line. Lighting ready before actors arrived, props pre-staged, stunt teams rehearsed, camera rigs pre-built, and location blocks timed to the minute. Stunt-heavy films normally require long rehearsal periods, endless adjustments, and time-consuming safety resets. But the team here created a hybrid system that borrowed from martial arts choreography, theater staging, and tactical training. Instead of improvising on set, they rehearsed every sequence weeks in advance in a warehouse environment. By the time cameras rolled, the actors were performing familiar movements, reducing the number of takes, protecting the shooting schedule, and limiting overtime costs. This is production engineering at its finest. Do the heavy lifting off the clock so that on-the-clock hours become pure execution. Leadership hierarchy also played a pivotal role. With two directors sharing responsibilities, there was an initial risk of decision overlap or communication bottlenecks. But these directors had spent years in the stunt world, where hierarchy is sacred for safety. That culture carried over. One director focused on performance, framing, and emotional continuity, while the other handled stunt execution, camera movement, and technical choreography. It was a dual-director system functioning like co-COS of a fast-moving tech company, each with clearly defined domains and aligned incentives. The assistant directors and production managers acted as the operational backbone. They coordinated department timing, location transitions, crew rotations, meal breaks, and nightly resets. This film was built in New York City, an environment where logistical unpredictability can destroy budgets. Parking restrictions, sound limitations, weather patterns, and permit windows all demanded seamless communication across hundreds of crew members. The AD team essentially ran a miniature city every day, keeping the machine moving without stalling. Another underappreciated factor is workforce allocation. The stunt team wasn't just a group of performers. They were an adaptable labor force capable of filling multiple roles. Many played on-screen enemies in some scenes and served as tactical advisors in others. This multitasking approach reduced the need for hiring additional specialists, lowering labor costs while increasing internal expertise. In the world of studio economics, cross-functional workers are a treasure. Production also relied on a well-planned gear footprint. Instead of bringing massive trucks filled with redundant equipment, the filmmakers opted for a highly optimized kit, a small collection of camera bodies, selected lenses, modular lighting, and compact rigs. This reduced setup times and made the crew more agile. The philosophy was simple: if a tool doesn't serve at least two purposes, it doesn't come to set. It's the same lean methodology mindset that successful startups employ. Location management was another triumph. New York is a famously expensive filming environment, but the production leveraged tax incentives, off-peak scheduling, and relationships with local authorities to minimize cost exposure. Night shoots were strategically scheduled in clusters to avoid constant resetting of lighting and equipment. Interior locations were chosen not only for aesthetic value but for logistical convenience: high ceilings for lighting rigs, multiple exits for crew flow, and load-in access for equipment. Every site was chosen like a financial investment. Emotional value weighed against logistical cost. Then there's the hidden world of studio oversight. While the directors were pushing creative boundaries, producers and studio executives were constantly analyzing cost reports, daily shooting logs, and projected timelines. Studio economies are delicate. If a film goes over budget, it jeopardizes future projects. If it finishes under budget, it strengthens internal trust. This project became a model of fiscal discipline, earning goodwill that later allowed for expanded sequels. The studio saw that this team could deliver high quality on tight margins, a rare and valuable combination. Another important aspect of production management here is risk mitigation. Stunt-heavy films carry safety hazards, insurance complexities, and liability exposure. The production established strict safety protocols, daily stunt briefings, and on-set medical readiness. These systems protected the crew while also protecting the budget. A single major injury can halt filming for days or weeks. By anticipating risks, the production avoided costly shutdowns. The film also benefited from a flexible night-to-day reset system, where crew rotations were managed to avoid burnout. Overtime is one of the biggest hidden drains on an action film's budget. By intelligently tracking crew hours and staggering call times, the managers preserved both safety and financial stability. It's not glamorous, but it's the kind of invisible efficiency that separates financially successful productions from cautionary tales. Finally, consider the production pipeline itself, the movement of footage from camera to data wranglers to editorial teams. Digital workflows allowed near-instant review of complex sequences. If a shot was slightly off, the team could adjust immediately rather than discovering the issue weeks later in post-production. This prevented costly reshoots and preserved the film's schedule integrity. In studio economics, proactive correction always beats reactive repair. When you consider all these elements, tight scheduling, disciplined budgeting, multi-role workforce, streamlined gear, rehearsed choreography, and razor-sharp leadership, you see a film that functions like a highly optimized factory. Every department feeds into the next. Every decision is made with consequence awareness. Every hour is accounted for. The production doesn't feel industrial, it feels alive, precise, and confident. And in that harmony between creativity and operational discipline lies the real brilliance of its production. It is a film built with the soul of an artist and the efficiency of an engineer. What's fascinating about examining the historical and scientific accuracy of this film is that it doesn't operate in the same category as biopics or war dramas, where one compares scenes against documented events. Instead, this film builds a world that behaves like a living ecosystem, one that borrows elements from real history, real combat science, and real organizational structures, then reimagines them into a heightened but surprisingly grounded universe. The brilliance lies not in strict factual replication, but in how the film uses realism as scaffolding for myth-making. Let's begin with the historical lineage of assassins. While the film presents a near-mythic underworld ruled by codes, currencies, and rituals, its roots trace back to real-world traditions. Medieval guilds, yakuza hierarchies, clandestine Cold War units, and specialized intelligence agencies all influenced the film's portrayal of a regulated lethal economy. Historically, professional killers, whether state-sanctioned or independent, operated with strict rules, contractual obligations, and internal codes of conduct. The idea of a continental hotel, where violence is forbidden, echoes diplomatic safe zones used throughout intelligence history. Embassies, neutral territories, and black sites all created pockets of untouchable space, and the film borrows that socio-political logic to build its own mythology. The gold coin system is another interesting blend of historical and fictional. Real contract killers do not use literal gold coins, of course, but the concept of a parallel currency used only within a closed network is grounded in real intelligence operations. Spy communities often use token-based systems, access cards, secure vouchers, and untraceable forms of compensation. The coins in the movie symbolize a mix of medieval tokens, mafia markers, and modern black market economics. They feel like a physical embodiment of trust and legitimacy, more ritualistic than realistic but psychologically plausible. Now let's turn to firearms, tactics, and combat science. This is where the film's accuracy becomes striking. Unlike many action movies that exaggerate gun physics or rely on impossible feats, this film takes a more grounded approach. The protagonist's firearm handling is influenced heavily by center-axis relock car, John Wick-style three-gun competition techniques, and real-world tactical systems used by law enforcement and military operators. His transitions between weapons, his habit of conducting quick chamber checks, his economy of movement during reloads, and his use of close-quarters retention shooting all reflect real training. But the film also stylizes these movements with a choreography-first mindset. In real combat, no one fights as gracefully or consistently as seen on screen. Real close-quarters engagements are chaotic, improvised, and rarely last more than a few seconds. Here, we see the science of movement blended with the precision of dance. The accuracy of the techniques is high, the continuity of execution is cinematic. It is accurate but optimized. The hand-to-hand combat is equally grounded. Techniques from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Judo, Japanese Aikido, and modern police control systems are blended into what fans now recognize as the franchise's signature style. Throws, holds, and joint manipulations are performed with realistic leverage, and the protagonist's weight shifts reflect legitimate grappling strategy. Scientifically, the biomechanics are correct. What's stylized is the stamina. Real fights do not last this long, nor do fighters maintain this level of breath control under high-intensity exertion. But that's the balance the film strikes. Physiological plausibility, cinematic endurance. Moving deeper into realism, let's consider the ballistic science. The sound design presents weapon discharge with a more subdued sonic profile, avoiding the exaggerated bass-heavy gunshots common in Hollywood. In reality, firearms are deafening in enclosed spaces. The film softens this for audience comfort. Blood spatter, muzzle flash, and recoil behavior are moderately realistic but slightly stylized to maintain continuity and readability. The protagonist fire controls his shots and maintains muzzle discipline, rare in mainstream action, commendable in accuracy. But where the film departs from scientific realism is in survivability. The protagonist absorbs impacts, falls, and injuries that would likely incapacitate or kill a real person. He moves with minimal impairment despite broken ribs, deep lacerations, and bruising that would compromise mobility. This isn't unrealistic in a thoughtless way, it's deliberate myth-making. The film positions him as a figure of legend, someone whispered about like a historical specter. His resilience is not meant to reflect biology, it reflects his symbolic weight. Now let's examine the organizational realism of the criminal underworld. The structure presented here is far more orderly, ritualistic, and ethically coded than real criminal networks. Actual mafia groups, cartels, and syndicates are messy, politically fractured, and governed by power struggles, not polished rules. However, the film borrows core concepts: hierarchy, favor systems, blood oaths, and debt-based loyalty. Historically, these elements appear in groups ranging from the Sicilian Mafia to the Russian Voryvyzhak. But none of these real groups possess the clean, almost aristocratic structure seen in the film. That structure is designed less for realism and more for the emotional satisfaction of witnessing a world where consequences have weight and reputations matter. The Continental's "no killing on company grounds" is one of the film's most iconic rules. Real criminal organizations occasionally maintain sacred spaces, churches, funerals, weddings, where violence is considered taboo. Intelligence agencies have similar informal restraints. But the film heightens this into a ceremonial law, enforced with precision. It's historically inspired but fictionally perfected. And finally, let's address the portrayal of grief and trauma. This is perhaps the film's most scientifically accurate dimension. The protagonist's emotional shutdown, his avoidance of social contact, his reliance on physical ritual to regain control, and his sudden reversion to old habits after a traumatic loss reflect real psychological patterns. Neuroscientists note that grief can reawaken dormant behavioral pathways, especially in those with intense former identities. His transformation isn't unrealistic, it's painfully human. Taken together, the film's historical and scientific accuracy is a deliberate blend of authenticity and myth. It gives the audience a world that feels possible, not literal, grounded, not restricted, honest but elevated. It borrows just enough truth to earn trust, then ascends into storytelling where realism is a foundation, not a cage. Cinematography in this film is not simply a method of recording action. It is the emotional architecture through which the audience enters the protagonist's inner world. The visual engineering choices are built on a philosophy of clarity, rhythm, and psychological resonance. Every frame feels as though someone measured the geometry of the viewer's gaze, aligned it with the emotional pulse of the scene, and then sculpted light, shadow, and movement around that alignment. What emerges is a kinetic visual language that behaves like a living organism, structured, adaptive, and responsive to every shift in mood and momentum. One of the most striking cinematographic choices is the film's devotion to readability of action. In an era dominated by shaky cameras and frenetic editing, the filmmakers made a deliberate commitment. The camera must behave like an observer, not a participant. It must guide the audience rather than overwhelm them. This decision shaped everything: lens selection, camera height, distance from subject, and even the choreography itself. The result is a visual grammar where every motion has room to breathe, every strike is visible, and every spatial relationship is clear. This is not just aesthetic discipline, it is engineering discipline. The cinematographers treat space as data, ensuring that viewers never lose track of momentum. Lighting is equally intentional. The film uses high-contrast night exteriors, neon interiors, and soft household warmth to create emotional zones. Each zone corresponds to a different psychological state. Warm tungsten light represents memory, peace, and the life he once cherished. Cool blue and cyan light represents grief, isolation, and emotional paralysis. Deep reds and magentas represent threshold moments, the point where calm becomes violence. Pulsating neon represents the underworld's chaotic heartbeat. This color logic is not random. It is the visual equivalent of a musical score. The film uses color to signal emotional transitions long before they happen narratively. The nightclub sequence, for example, is an explosion of saturated blues and reds. These hues act like pressure chambers. The tighter the hues compress, the more explosive the action becomes. The lighting is not simply illuminating bodies, it is mapping psychological tension. Lens physics also play a crucial role. The use of anamorphic lenses gives the film its signature cinematic width, but more importantly, it introduces subtle distortion at the edges of the frame. This distortion creates a slight curvature that subconsciously communicates unease. Faces feel elongated, hallways feel narrower, and action sequences feel faster. The geometry of the frame becomes part of the emotional design. When the protagonist moves, the world appears to shift around him, reinforcing the impression that he is a gravitational force within this universe. Camera movement is executed with an almost choreographic precision. Instead of chaotic handheld motion, the film favors steady tracking shots, lateral movements, and controlled pans. These movements create a sense of spatial intelligence. The viewer always understands where characters stand, how far danger is, and which direction the energy is flowing. Action scenes feel like geometric equations, not visual chaos. The camera doesn't shake to simulate intensity. Intensity emerges from choreography, timing, and spatial control. One of the quiet triumphs of the cinematography is the film's use of negative space. Empty hallways, long corridors, and darkened backgrounds are used to amplify both tension and isolation. When the protagonist stands alone in a room with shadows swallowing the edges of the frame, the emptiness becomes as expressive as any dialogue. Negative space is used as a psychological canvas. It gives weight to silence and scale to violence. The film's visual engineering also relies heavily on dynamic range control. Shooting in low light is notoriously difficult, as shadows can crush and highlights can blow out. But the ARRI Alexa sensor allows for balanced exposure even in challenging environments. This is why neon bulbs glow without bleeding into surrounding pixels, and why shadowy corners retain detail. The film's grading team enhances this dynamic range by carefully preserving black levels while selectively lifting skin tones, a method that keeps characters readable even in near darkness. This careful manipulation of exposure creates an atmosphere where darkness feels inviting rather than obstructive. Composition is another element where the film showcases remarkable discipline. Every frame is constructed with a clear center of gravity, the visual point around which motion flows. Sometimes it's the protagonist's face. Sometimes it's a doorway. Sometimes it's a gun barrel angled diagonally across the frame. This point of gravity allows the audience's eyes to settle, giving them a stable reference before the choreography unfolds. This technique is common in highly visual martial arts films, but here it is refined through Western cinematographic principles. The fusion feels fresh, coherent, and dramatically powerful. Then there is the use of reflections and glass. Mirrors, windows, polished floors, all become tools for visual layering. These reflective surfaces allow the frame to hold multiple planes of action simultaneously, adding depth and complexity without clutter. A reflection becomes a foreshadowing device. A silhouette in glass becomes a warning. A glimmer of movement behind a window becomes tension embodied. This is visual storytelling, not visual decoration. The nightclub sequence is the pinnacle of this visual engineering. The cinematography layers. Moving colored lights, sweating crowds, horizontal lens flares, gliding camera movement, fast choreography, and rhythmic sound. Yet despite this complexity, every moment is clear. The viewer never loses orientation. This clarity is not accidental. It is the product of meticulous pre-visualization. The directors and cinematographers built the entire sequence like an architectural blueprint, mapping camera paths, lighting cones, collision zones, and color transitions. The effect is overwhelming but organized, chaotic but comprehensible. Even the quieter scenes benefit from this engineering discipline. When the protagonist sits alone at home or visits his wife's grave, the camera holds still, framing him in gentle symmetry. These moments restore balance. They slow the heartbeat. They remind the viewer that beneath all the movement lies a man shaped by loss, not vengeance. The cinematography is the emotional spine of the film, a fusion of optical physics, architectural composition, color psychology, and movement discipline. It transforms the world into a space that feels both mythic and grounded, cold and intimate, violent and heartbreakingly human. If the cinematography shapes what we see, then the sound design shapes what we feel beneath the surface, the emotional frequency that vibrates under the visuals. This film's soundscape is engineered with the care of an acoustical architect, someone who understands that silence, echo, bass, and breath are not decorative elements but psychological tools. Every click, every footstep, every gunshot is placed with deliberation. And my literature-loving friends, it's in this careful arrangement of sound that the movie builds its heartbeat. Let's begin with the most defining characteristic, the clarity of sonic space. Modern action films often overload the sound field with constant noise, thundering bass, screaming metal, layered explosions. This film takes a different route. The mixers use a philosophy of aerated sound, where the spaces between sounds are as meaningful as the sounds themselves. Silence isn't emptiness, it's pressure. It's the calm before a strike. It's the emotional inhale before the exhale of violence. In the quiet scenes, you hear the small details, the soft rustle of a shirt, the gentle tapping of a dog's paws, the hum of an engine idling in a driveway. These microsounds create intimacy. They pull the viewer close to the protagonist's world, making his grief almost tactile. There's a moment early in the film where the sound of wind brushes through an empty home. Nothing is said, but everything is heard. Loneliness, memory, the faint echo of a life that once filled that silent space. When violence enters the picture, the sound design doesn't shift abruptly. Instead, it expands, opening a wider sonic field. Gunshots are crisp, tight, and directional. They lack the exaggerated Hollywood boom not because the filmmakers want realism, but because they want presence. Real gunfire indoors is deafening, chaotic. Here, the sound team tempers that realism, compressing the sonic energy just enough to avoid overwhelming the audience while preserving the metallic punch of impact. Each gunshot lands like a syllable in a sentence, sharp, meaningful, deliberate. The team uses Avid Pro Tools as their central platform for mixing and layering. You can sense the precision in the spatial design. Weapons fired in close quarters sound claustrophobic, short reverb tails, dense reflections. Weapons fired outdoors breathe more, the echoes stretch further, the sonic decay lasts longer. The mix behaves like a location-aware system. It respects the physics of space, treating sound not as an afterthought but as a collaborator in storytelling. The Foley work is remarkably subtle. Footsteps, fabric shifts, glass breaks, and body impacts feel grounded and tactile. There's a physicality to them, you can hear weight, pressure, and strain. When a punch lands, it's not the exaggerated thwack we associate with action films. Instead, you hear something closer to a dull thud, the kind that makes you wince because your body recognizes it. The Foley artist dialed back spectacle to enhance authenticity. One of the most brilliant aspects of the sound design is the use of silence as tension currency. Before major confrontations, the soundscape thins out. Ambient noise drops. Environmental reverb tightens. It's as if the world inhales. This technique mirrors psychological tension. When danger approaches, the human mind becomes hyper-focused, filtering out unnecessary stimuli. The film replicates that shift through sound, making the viewer experience a kind of anticipatory stillness. You hear less but you feel more. Now let's talk about the score, a fusion of electronic textures, dark ambient pulses, and industrial rhythms. The music acts like an emotional metronome. It doesn't tell you what to feel, it tells you when to feel. Rather than overlaying scenes with melodic cues, the score often behaves like a subterranean current of emotion. Pulsing bass lines underscore movement. Metallic echoes emphasize tension. Synthetic textures create a sense of modern myth. The composers use layered synthesizers, processed guitars, and deep percussive elements to create a sound that feels both human and machine-like, fitting for a protagonist who moves with mechanical efficiency but carries deep emotional wounds. In many scenes, the score sits just below conscious notice. You feel it more than you hear it. It's like the emotional equivalent of gravity, invisible but constant. What makes the score so powerful is how it interacts with action choreography. The music doesn't dominate the movement, it synchronizes with it. Beats align with strikes, pulses align with reloads, and bass drops align with emotional pivots. This is not accidental. The composers and sound editors worked closely with the directors, mapping musical cues to the architecture of the fight sequences. The effect is a rhythmic harmony between violence and sound, like watching a dancer move to a heartbeat. In the nightclub sequence, the music becomes a character. The pounding bass, the shifting tempos, the glowing synths, they create a sensory environment that mirrors the visual chaos. But what's astonishing is how the music softens or sharpens based on perspective. When the camera moves close to the protagonist, the music dampens slightly, allowing the viewer to enter his internal focus. When the camera pulls back into the crowd, the music blooms, reclaiming control of the environment. This perspective-sensitive mixing ensures that the viewer never loses emotional anchoring. The sound team also uses diegetic and non-diegetic sound blending. In some scenes, the music that plays within the world slowly transitions into the background score without the viewer noticing. This creates a seamless continuity of emotion. You feel like the environment itself is participating in the storytelling. There is also remarkable attention to the sound of breath. In high-intensity sequences, you can hear the protagonist's breathing, not exaggerated, not heroic, but controlled. It reflects real training. Breath is how fighters regulate rhythm and manage endurance. The sound designers amplify it just enough to feel intimate without drawing attention to the manipulation. It humanizes him in the midst of mythic violence. As the film reaches its emotional resolution, the music softens into something almost tender. The heavy percussion subsides, replaced by warmer tones and broader sonic textures. The final moments, especially the scene with the injured dog, allow space for the soundscape to exhale. Silence returns, but this time it is not heavy. It is healing. Sound design and music in this film are not decorative layers. They are the emotional circuitry connecting the viewer to the character's interior world. They create the heartbeat of the story, one that pulses with grief, clarity, discipline, and quiet humanity. Marketing this film was, in many ways, an experiment in audience psychology. The studio was not promoting a superhero, not promoting a long-awaited franchise, not promoting a familiar genre template. They were promoting a film built around controlled violence, emotional silence, and a star whose career was in a period of quiet recalibration. To sell such a film required more than posters and trailers. It required understanding human behavior, cultural sentiment, digital community patterns, and the emerging economics of attention. In other words, the marketing strategy itself became an exercise in audience analytics. The first major insight came from recognizing the power of Keanu Reeves as a digital myth, not just as an actor. At the time, he was known for humility, kindness, and philosophical quietness. Online communities adored him. This emotional goodwill was an asset, a kind of pre-existing brand capital. Marketing teams leaned into this subtly. Posters emphasized his face, not his weapons. Trailers highlighted his grief, not just his fury. Promotional interviews showcased his discipline, gentleness, and commitment to stunt work. The strategy was to sell the man before the violence. Because when audiences love the man, they will follow him into the story. Next came the analytical challenge of identifying the early adopters, the groups most likely to evangelize the film. Traditional four-quadrant marketing would have been wasteful. Instead, the studio targeted niche but influential clusters: action lovers, martial artists, tactical training communities, gaming enthusiasts, digital cinephiles, and online forums that value authenticity over spectacle. These groups respond strongly to films that treat action as craft rather than chaos. They're the viewers who pause scenes, analyze frames, and share breakdowns on the internet. Winning their trust was essential. The trailer strategy reflected this precision targeting. Rather than presenting a generic action preview, the first teaser emphasized clarity of choreography, long takes, clean movements, disciplined gun handling. This signaled a break from shaky cam conventions and immediately gained traction among viewers tired of visually incoherent action. The studio understood that clarity itself was a selling point. They were offering something the market lacked. One of the most unexpected audience analytics insights was the emotional impact of the dog. The marketing team quickly realized that the dog was not simply a plot device but a symbol with viral potential. Early test screenings revealed that viewers reacted powerfully and loudly to the emotional stakes surrounding the dog. Strategically, the studio allowed this shockwave to ripple organically. They never reduced the dog to a joke or gimmick. They let audiences carry the emotional message themselves. This is a form of organic virality, letting viewers generate momentum through emotional conversation rather than forced promotional pushes. Digital advertising leaned heavily into A/B-tested assets. Different versions of posters and trailers were shown to micro-audiences, and analytics teams tracked click-through rates, watch completion percentages, and social engagement metrics. Trailers that emphasized grief performed well with older audiences. Trailers that emphasized choreography clarity performed well with younger and action-focused demographics. Trailers centered on the underworld mythos performed well with thriller fans. This data allowed the studio to refine promotional materials until each audience segment received the version most aligned with their emotional triggers. Influencer marketing was still in its developing era, but the studio identified early that content creators specializing in action breakdowns were a potent force. Sending exclusive clips to YouTube channels, MMA analysts, and early action commentators gave the movie grassroots credibility. Unlike corporate promotional language, these creators spoke in technical detail, praising movement mechanics, tactical form, and the choreography's discipline. This built trust in niche communities that often reject mainstream hype. The international marketing strategy was equally calculated. Action films traditionally rely on visual spectacle to succeed abroad, but this one relied on precision, mythology, and emotional simplicity. These qualities translate across languages and cultures. The marketing teams emphasized the mysteriousness of the underworld, the elegance of the continental hotel, the stoic charisma of the protagonist, and the universal theme of personal loss. These elements made the film legible to diverse markets without heavy localization. Demographic analysis revealed two particularly strong segments. Men ages 18 to 34, unsurprising for an action film. Or women ages 25 to 45, a surprising but powerful demographic. Why did the second group respond strongly? Analytics suggested two reasons. The emotional stakes, grief, love, and healing through the dog, resonated. Keanu Reeves' humane public image made the violence feel anchored in moral clarity rather than brutality. This dual demographic resonance created a broad emotional base for the film's success. Social media campaigns leaned on economies of repetition. Rather than flooding feeds with dozens of different ads, the studio focused on a handful of emotionally compelling moments. One tagline in particular became the backbone of the campaign. "He's not afraid of John Wick. He should be." This line worked because it used negative space in storytelling. It reveals almost nothing but implies everything. It allows the mind to fill in mythic proportions. Analytics teams monitored conversation heat maps across Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, and early-stage Instagram discussions. When they noticed spikes in conversation around clean action, they released more behind-the-scenes materials showing training regimens and stunt preparation. When emotional conversations spiked around the dog, they emphasized that element in poster rollouts. The marketing became responsive rather than static, shifting to match the living psychology of the audience. At the theatrical level, release timing was a strategic masterstroke. Instead of competing with massive holiday blockbusters or early summer behemoths, the film premiered during a quieter season, a window where adult thrillers could breathe without facing heavy franchise competition. This created a counter-programming advantage, positioning the film as an alternative for viewers craving something fresh and emotionally grounded. Finally, the long-term marketing success came from the film's afterlife. Streaming data confirmed that the film had high rewatch rates, a key indicator of long-tail profitability. People weren't just watching it, they were studying it, sharing clips, discussing choreography. The film became a language within online culture. Memes, GIFs, analysis videos, and homage edits turned into free marketing. The franchise grew before the sequels were even announced. This, ultimately, is the most astonishing part of its marketing story. The film's authenticity became its greatest advertisement. Instead of selling spectacle, they sold craftsmanship. Instead of selling noise, they sold clarity. Instead of selling chaos, they sold discipline. And audiences rewarded them with loyalty. The critical reception of this film was one of those fascinating moments in modern cinema when critics and audiences seemed to rediscover something they didn't realize they had been missing: clarity, elegance, discipline, and emotional honesty within the action genre. It wasn't marketed as an awards contender, it didn't arrive with festival prestige, and it wasn't positioned as a prestige drama. Yet when it premiered, the reaction felt like a collective exhale. Viewers and critics alike recognized that this film had restored something sacred: the idea that action can be beautiful, meaningful, and emotionally precise. Critics praised the film's clean visual language, its refreshing rejection of shaky cam, and its commitment to practical choreography. Many reviews noted how legible the action was, a quality that had become rare. Others emphasized the emotional simplicity that fueled the narrative. The protagonist's grief was not convoluted. It was pure, immediate, and universal. A man mourning his wife and the last gift she left him is not a complicated story. But the film's ability to express that grief through silence, movement, and visual rhythm made it resonate on a deeper level. What surprised critics most, perhaps, was the world building. They expected a simple revenge thriller. Instead, they discovered a fully developed ecosystem: the Continental, the gold coins, the assassin code, that felt simultaneously mythic and grounded. Reviewers commented on how this world invited imagination without overshadowing the emotional core. It felt like the first chapter of a novel you didn't know you wanted to read. Audiences were even more enthusiastic. Viewer ratings across major platforms skyrocketed. Word of mouth spread with unusual speed, especially online. The film developed an early cult following that grew rapidly as viewers praised its choreography, its philosophy of violence, and its unexpectedly emotional depth. Fans created analysis videos, fantasy lore expansions, and breakdowns of the world's rules long before sequels were confirmed. The film wasn't just enjoyed, it was studied. That is a rare honor for an action film. When it came to awards, the industry's traditional bias against action cinema kept it from major categories. Action films rarely feature in categories like Best Picture, Best Director, or Best Cinematography, even when they display exceptional craftsmanship. Nevertheless, the film did receive recognition from genre organizations, stunt associations, and action-focused festivals. The stunt community in particular championed the film as a triumph. It became a case study in what happens when stunt performers are trusted as creative leaders. Many industry advocates argued that the film should have sparked a broader conversation about including stunts as an official Oscar category. And while that shift has not yet occurred, this film continues to be cited as part of the movement pushing for that recognition. Financial success further strengthened the film's critical legacy. The combination of positive reviews and strong audience engagement created a perfect commercial tailwind. The sequels that followed, each expanding the world and deepening the lore, amplified its cultural presence. But what's remarkable is how critics looked back at the original film after the franchise success. With each new installment, appreciation for the first chapter grew. Critics began viewing it not as a small action experiment but as the spark that ignited an entire cinematic universe. The legacy of the film also extends into the technical realm. Action directors and cinematographers worldwide cite it as a turning point. After years of chaotic editing dominating Hollywood action, this film reminded the industry that clarity, craft, and practical choreography have their own power. Many directors began adopting longer takes, cleaner coverage, and more grounded stunt work in response. The influence spread across Hollywood, Bollywood, Korean action cinema, and even streaming series. It reframed the action genre's expectations, raising the standard for visual comprehension and emotional engagement. Culturally, the protagonist became an icon, not of invulnerability but of focused determination. The character's mythic reputation, combined with his emotional softness, created a powerful contrast. He became a symbol of stoic resilience, controlled grief, and disciplined response to trauma. Internet culture embraced this duality. Memes proliferated, references embedded themselves into everyday conversation, and phrases associated with the character became part of popular vocabulary. The dog, perhaps unexpectedly, became a cultural symbol as well. Viewers saw the emotional breaking point not simply as a plot-inciting incident but as a universal representation of last-strand grief. The symbolism resonated deeply, particularly with audiences who had experienced loss. It humanized the action. It made the violence feel not like spectacle but like consequence. From a sociological and psychological standpoint, the film also tapped into a cultural moment where people were craving narratives of moral clarity. The early 2010s had seen an influx of morally ambiguous heroes, anti-heroes, and characters driven by complex, sometimes nihilistic motivations. This film offered something simpler, not simplistic but emotionally transparent. The protagonist was driven by love, loss, and the instinct to reclaim dignity after being violated. It allowed viewers to experience catharsis in a world where lines between right and wrong often felt blurred. Looking ahead, the film's legacy forecast is exceptionally strong. It will be studied in film schools for its choreography, lighting, and world building. It will continue to influence action design across continents. It will be referenced in discussions about stunt direction, long-take action cinema, and the role of practical effects in an increasingly digital industry. The character will remain one of the most recognizable figures in modern action mythology, and his narrative, grounded in grief, discipline, and reluctant violence, will remain timeless. Even decades from now, this film will likely be viewed as the quintessential example of action purity, the moment when Hollywood remembered that you can move an audience not by overwhelming them, but by respecting their intelligence. Its sequels may grow larger and louder, but nothing will replace the intimate precision of the original. That first chapter, with its quiet heart and thunderous consequences, will always be the point where myth met craft. In the long arc of cinematic history, this film will stand not only as a successful action movie but as a transformative one. A film that changed how the world thinks about movement, clarity, grief, and consequence. It will remain a touchstone for directors seeking discipline, for stunt performers seeking recognition, and for audiences seeking a story where emotion and engineering collide in breathtaking harmony. There are some films that stay with us not because of the size of their explosions or the weight of their spectacle, but because of the quiet places where emotion, discipline, and craft meet. As I reflect on this film with you, literature-loving friends, I'm struck by how something built on violence can feel so profoundly human. Beneath every carefully choreographed movement and every clean frame lies a story about grief, memory, and the fragile threads that tether us to hope. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about this film. It merges art, technology, and capital into something unexpectedly tender. From the moment the story begins, we sense that we are watching a man navigate a world he once mastered but no longer belongs to. The grief he carries behaves almost like a second skin, quiet, heavy, invisible to those who don't look closely. What the film achieves so beautifully is the way it lets us inhabit that grief without drowning in it. The visuals act like architecture for his emotions. The sound design acts like the pulse beneath his decisions. The choreography becomes a language he returns to when words fail him. Nothing feels exaggerated, nothing feels careless. Everything flows with a sense of internal gravity. And then there is the technological elegance, the way the filmmaking tools seem to disappear behind the emotional experience. It takes enormous skill to make choreography look effortless, to make long takes feel natural, to keep camera movement disciplined and unobtrusive. But this film manages that illusion with the precision of a watchmaker. The ARRI camera sensors, the anamorphic lenses, the LED lighting strategy, the long rehearsal pipelines, all of it works silently in service of feeling. The technology never competes with the emotion, it deepens it. That is the kind of harmony cinema rarely achieves. On the financial side, the story becomes even more inspiring. In a world where studios often equate meaning with money, here was a film that resisted the urge to inflate its scale. It did not depend on massive budgets, global sets, or overloaded CGI. Instead, it invested in clarity, craft, and human presence. It bet on precision rather than spectacle, discipline rather than noise. And that bet paid off in a way few could have predicted. What began as a modest, tightly contained experiment evolved into a global franchise and a cultural phenomenon. It demonstrated that financial success does not always require risk aversion. Sometimes it requires daring to be small, focused, intimate. But beyond the craft, beyond the technology, beyond the financial intelligence, what I love most about this film is the emotional honesty at its core. Violence in this story is not glamorous. It is not celebrated. It is not fetishized. It is simply the language a broken man uses to reclaim something that was stolen from him. The film never lets us forget that he didn't want this world anymore. He didn't want this identity. He didn't want this life of precision and consequence. He had built something softer, something quieter, something filled with the warmth of love and the possibility of healing. And when that was taken from him, he didn't return to violence out of desire. He returned because grief pushes us into old versions of ourselves we hoped we'd never see again. That is why the emotional resonance of the final moments lingers so powerfully. After all the noise, all the movement, all the beautifully engineered violence, the story closes with something gentle. A wounded dog, a quiet walk, an unspoken suggestion that healing is still possible. It is not redemption. It is not closure. It is simply a second chance at softness. And in that moment, the film reminds us that even in a world built on precision and consequence, tenderness can still exist at the edges of a broken heart. This harmony, between art and engineering, emotion and design, violence and humanity, is what elevates the film into something greater than an action story. It becomes a meditation on grief, a study in discipline, a demonstration of how stories can be both tightly constructed and deeply felt. It proves that cinema does not need to shout to be powerful. It can whisper. It can breathe. It can remain quiet for long stretches and still move the world inside a viewer's chest. As we conclude this journey together, I find myself grateful for the way the film respects its audience. It never treats us like passive watchers. It treats us like participants, people capable of recognizing nuance, appreciating craftsmanship, and feeling deeply even in the midst of violence. And that, perhaps, is the greatest gift any film can offer, the sense that our attention is valued and our emotional intelligence trusted. If you found this deep dive meaningful, my literature-loving friends, consider liking and subscribing so we can keep decoding the business and beauty of cinema together.